Hey everybody, today I'm going to talk about A History of Christianity in America by Mark A. Granquist. This is a new book from Baker Academic. Thank you to Baker for sending me this for review. I was really interested in this one. This is going to be my honest take on it. I'll talk you through my typical format of summarizing the main idea, which, although you'll probably guess, is pretty obvious based on the cover and title. But I'll summarize the main idea. I'll talk about the research behind this project, the readability of its style, and then just give some of my reactionary thoughts at the end. Just kind of what did I think about this overall. So let's jump into it. The main idea of A History of Christianity in America is a single volume history of Christianity in the land known as America. So yeah, what this book does is, in a pretty short number of pages, cover a vast swath of religious history. And I'll say a little bit more about the different... Anytime you talk about a single volume historical book like this, you have to comment on the places where the writer emphasized or maybe de-emphasized certain kind of historical narratives or aspects that could have been given more pages. That's just always the case. There's just always trade-offs, being made with especially single volume histories like this. One thing that Granquist does in this that is interesting is he very heavily weights the amount of content given to the roots of religion in America. So what I mean by that is he spends a lot of pages talking about the history of religion in the places that colonized and settled the land that would eventually be called America. There's a lot of discussion about kind of the beginnings, the ingredients that went into the American religious stew. He does a lot of work in a single volume at getting at the pre-existing kind of religious structures and stuff, or what would become religious structures in America, which I think is very interesting. So that's one thing that kind of tweaks this project a little bit from other single volume histories of America, or of American religion, at least. But what he does is he moves chapter by chapter. It's just pretty much a straight chronological history. Some histories will go thematically, like they'll trace a theme and then go backtrack chronologically. He pretty much just goes a straight chapter by chapter chronological framework, which is easy to follow, going through pre-revolution America, through revolutionary America, and he follows all the major events up to the Civil War, goes through the 19th century, the 20th century. And after pivoting from all that work to do in the origins, then he gives a pretty, I would say, even pace, kind of relatively even amount of attention and page count to each of the kind of eras after that. So just carrying through kind of what has Christian religious structure and life and practice looked like in broad scope in the United States of America since its revolutionary founding in 1775, 1776. What does that look like? What are the themes that you can trace? He traces themes of race. He traces themes of immigration. He traces denominational, waxing and waning. He traces general religiosity when it peaked in the country and when it has dipped in some maybe surprising ways to the uninitiated reader. And then you also get some layer of just general American history, of course, because he comments on the big events in the particularly the formative leaders and presidencies and stuff along the way. Though it is weighted towards thinking about religious leaders, religious thinkers, and writers. It's not weighted towards the quote-unquote secular, non-religious side of the historical narrative that are there. So the reader of this book gets in about 350 pages, gets a broad tour through American history with primarily a lens on America's unique religious life and expression. That's what the book is all about, which, yeah, you probably gathered just from the title and the cover, like I said. But so let's move forward. I will get into I'll dig into some of my specific reactions to some of the ways he presents this project at the end. But the research behind it, not going to spend a ton of time on this, but he is... I had never read anything by him before, unless I'd read an article or an essay somewhere along the line that I'm not remembering. I'd never read any of his books, but he is a scholar of religion and history, so this is his wheelhouse. The research is very good. One thing I want to say about the research, though, in terms of the reading experience of this book, is it's actually not heavily cited or footnoted throughout the text. He takes the approach, which, if you're in the right kind of expectation mindset, this is great. I love when books do this when I'm expecting it. He takes the approach of each chapter is kind of its own little long essay on that particular era, and then at the end of that essay or chapter, he lists a bibliography for that material. So it's not cited heavily throughout, but then you get a list of sources that particularly he drew on for that particular slice of the book. And I actually really, really like that, because when later on, when I'm wanting to remember, for example, if I'm studying religion around the Civil War, for example, and I know this book is on my shelf, I know I can pull down that chapter and I can look at his bibliography and jump right into some sources. So as kind of a reference back and forth, or like a book to keep on your shelf on the research side of things, it's really, really helpful for that. And also, just by virtue of being a single volume work, you can find stuff a little bit more easily. It's in there somewhere, as opposed to going through a series of books where you're trying to remember, certain references or whatever. So I like the research approach here, but it is more of that kind of accessible intro, not heavily cited, not heavily footnoted, whatever. There are some, how books like this will have primary texts, like excerpts and snippets from letters or speeches or books of the time. There are little grayed out boxed margins that will have a little readings, but it's pretty minimal. If anything, I might have liked even a little more of that, but it is there, but it's pretty minimal in his treatment of it in this book. So that's a little bit about the research. Hopefully give you a sense of kind of what he's pulling on. Okay. The readability of it, this is right down the middle. It's readable. I think it's pitched towards a little bit more of an approachable style. It's very straightforward. It's not particularly, there's no particular stylistic flourishes or anything particularly, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. Nothing particularly grabs you about this style, setting it apart stylistically from other treatments. But it's not hard to read, so maybe that sets it apart. It's not difficult to read. It's very easy to track, easy to understand the arguments he's making, the historical judgments he's making. He does a good job contextualizing certain of his themes, especially themes like denominations and immigration, and inter kind of like almost factional tensions within Christian expressions in America. He does a really good job tracing those themes throughout the whole book, and contextualizing them within events that are happening in the whole kind of broader setting of religious life in the country. So those things are easy to track because the style is very approachable, very straightforward. Nothing particularly special to say about it, I have to say, but it is, it's very serviceable. It's very fine. That was my takeaway from just the stylistic approach of the book, kind of page for page. So if you're interested in history, my last thing I'll say on that, if you're interested, I think this is going to be just a relatively easy read. Okay, now let me get into my reaction. I'll dig into this book a little bit. I liked this book. It definitely brings something saying it's totally unique would be an overstatement, but it brings something interesting and kind of a different flavor or a different emphasis than some other single volume works do. I'm also just in general super interested in, I am American, and I'm super interested from the States. I'm super interested in, I think the religious culture of the United States is just so interesting. It's so interesting. And so I love reading about it. And I particularly like single volume works because they kind of, by virtue of them being a single volume, they force you to get a big picture. So that's why I was interested in this one. And I kind of read it with a sense of like, is he going to do anything different from others? And to that end, let me comment on some of the things that I think he does well here. So I talked about this at the very beginning. I was really interested in the fact that he spends, in a 350-page book, he spends over 100 pages just on the kind of the origins, like pre-1775. Like that first over 100 pages, almost a third of the book is spent on everything before 1775. I think that's really interesting, and that's one thing I like about this book as compared to others that attempt a single volume of American history. And I think that sets some interesting groundwork for what you learn as you progress through the book. So he spends a lot of time, for example, finally give a specific example here. He spends a lot of time talking about kind of the Spanish Catholic kind of geopolitical and colonial efforts, particularly in places, what would now be known as south of the United States, or into Texas, or even over into California. He really maps out a lot of what that looked like before the Revolutionary War. And you can start to see from that trend lines about certain like Catholic culture and Catholic influence later on in the life of the United States, which is very interesting because Catholicity, Roman Catholicism, was not prominent until much later. But then you can kind of connect back to some of those real the seedbed of it, before 1775. Really, really interesting. He does really good, I think, really good work on how the English Reformation had certain seeds that kind of pointed things in a certain direction that would really take root in the ongoing life of the United States, especially because for obvious reasons, British colonial efforts were hugely normative and formative for America and for religious practice. So all the stuff on the English Reformation and how that, for example, affected the way the Puritans thought about their own religious life and their religious practice as they came to the States, really interesting. I think he does a very good job pushing back on some of the pop narratives about like people, moving to the States for religious freedom, and he does good historical judgment on the fact that most people came here more for like economic reasons or maybe more legal reasons, or they just wanted to start a new life, kind of setting it not really with explicit religious motives. He does a very good job contextualizing the efforts particularly in the New England area or the New England region, as we know it now, which is where I live. I live in Maine. Like, he does a really good job contextualizing the efforts to kind of almost put in new established religious life, congregational religious life in that area. And he nuances that from other parts of the country that had like kind of nominal, Anglican, or what we would now call Episcopal, not really established, but quasi-established religious life in different parts of the country, but the tension between whether religion should be established or not. He does a really good job teasing all of that out. He does a really good job talking about the Enlightenment, kind of Enlightenment milieu, and how that was affecting how a lot of these thinkers at the Revolutionary era were thinking about religion and the place of religion in the life of a nation. Anyways, all of this stuff, I'm just kind of teasing at some of the threads. He spends a good bit of time digging into all of that stuff, and I think I really like that choice in this book. For such a relatively short book covering a wide swath of history, the choice to really sit in the origins is, I think, very interesting, and I think it lends itself towards, the reader gets a better sense of like how certain trajectories were set that then would go on to develop over the course of the next couple centuries. So a couple of things I really like that I think he does well here. I think he traces the theme of immigration really well, and contextualizing certain influxes of certain people groups from other parts of the globe, and specifically the religious and cultural life that kind of they brought with them, and also the backlashes and tensions that created in the religious life that existed in the country already. So one example of that is there's really good helpful discussion about the growth of Roman Catholicism at certain specific times in American history, and the tensions that generated with essentially what was basically a Protestant establishment, not in the law and legal sense, but like culturally, there was a Protestant establishment in the country, and the growth of Roman Catholicism really triggered a lot of backlashes and tensions at certain specific points in history that can be directly connected to immigration patterns. It's really, really, really interesting, and lends a better kind of more of a robust understanding of how the history played itself out there. And then on a related note, in addition to immigration, another theme he treats really well, I think, is the denominational histories, basically. So he gets into how did certain denominations, for example, weather or not weather the Civil War, and how did certain denominations fraction over the issue of slavery and race and race relations, and then how did that, he comes back to those themes over and over in each future chapter, so you can kind of see how these historical movements waxed and waned, and denominations, waxed and waned, and how certain denominations kind of adapted to the religious context, or to the cultural and geographic and geopolitical context in America well or quickly, and how that affected their life and their trajectory in the country. So 2 examples of that. One of my big just takeaways from this book is he really helps you understand how the Baptists and the Methodists in particular were 2 denominations that just exploded in the religious life of America in ways that are surprising if you kind of take a snapshot of the country in 1775. The strongest practice or official quote unquote religion would have been Anglicanism or Episcopalianism as we would know now. So the idea that Baptists and Methodists would just radically eclipse the Anglicans is actually shocking from that vantage point of 1775, but he traces how that happened, and especially makes some good arguments about how those two denominations in particular grasped the reality that the country was expanding out through the so-called frontier, how the country was expanding so rapidly, and then those denominations, I don't know if adjusted themselves is the right word, or kind of strategically adapted or changed their piety and expression or their evangelistic tactics, whatever words you want to use there, maybe all the above, how they adapted to that reality on the ground, and so exploded in growth and influence. And then that leads me to some of my final comments. There's so many things I could pull out just because the history is so interesting, but what I'm really trying to draw out for you is just some of the things that he develops, he focuses thematically on. And so I think he does also, so in addition to the whole tracking immigration patterns and denominational kind of tensions and conflicts and growths and changes, he does a great job in this book, and I felt myself even gaining some deeper understanding, having some light bulbs go off in how something like revivalism is such an, not totally unique to America, but it's a very American aspect of religious life, like revivalism, entrepreneurial revivalism, is how I would say it maybe. That's really wrapped up in the life of religion in America, Christianity specifically, and he helped me understand and contextualize how that took root in the frontier expansion, and especially the Baptists and the Methodists, like grabbing onto that, and then how like the awakenings obviously play into all this, and he does really good discussion talking about the differences between the awakenings and how the different leaders kind of shepherded those movements. But like combining these threads of like certain denominations that had more of a readiness to grasp an entrepreneurial, free-spirited approach towards expansion, combined with the frontier push, and the really rapid expansion there. He does talk about the treatment of the Native Americans in all of those chapters, which is really tragic. So he doesn't gloss over that. He also does talk really, I think, sensibly and honestly about the treatment of Africans and African slaves during all of this time too, and the growth of African denominations or African American denominations in response to not being included in structures in church. So all that's there. He doesn't gloss over any of those kind of more tragic or difficult aspects of the narratives. But the whole idea of the expansionist religion, the revivalist practices, how that was tied into, and especially eventually you get to the 20th century and you talk about Azusa Street and the explosion of Pentecostalism. Like, it's really interesting to see these see these threads, and you can see them in a macro view because, again, this is a single volume book that moves along at a fairly good clip. None of the chapters are overly long or get overly weighted down, and so the reader gets a sense of, you can kind of connect the dots in that zoomed out sense of how things progressed, and it helps you contextualize certain aspects of American religious life today and the entrepreneurial, freewheeling, expansionistic, revivalistic elements of a lot of popular Christianity, I think, are still there. And it's really interesting to see that they've been there for a long time, and you can kind of see the historical conditions from which those things arose. And so I just think this book is a straightforward, well organized, easy to follow, enjoyable to read exercise in learning about how that all developed. So at the end of this review, I hope that gives you a sense of what this book is kind of driving at specifically. And I would just say, in terms of recommendations for this, I think if you are like neck deep, if you're a historical scholar, if you're neck deep in all this stuff, I don't know that this book is going to give you anything wildly new. If you've read a lot of like multi-volume works on American religious life, or if you're deeply studied in certain eras, this book is a little bit more of that zoomed out view. Though he doesn't do glosses, he doesn't do like unhelpful summaries. I've been critical of some other books that I think are just way too surface level. I found this book, it lives in that more summary kind of territory, but I did not find that it compromised on depth or precision at all, which I think is a really hard balance to strike. And I think he really did a quite a good job on that, given that he's trying to keep it, in that 350 page kind of band or kind of mark. But if you are someone who is just interested, just a fan of history, I would put myself maybe more in this camp. I'm just a fan of history, and I just enjoy the process of, I've read books like this before, and I still get excited when I read a new one to just like start at the beginning and go through the whole story. If you're that kind of reader, I think this is really great. It would be an easy recommendation. I think he emphasizes certain themes that I talked about, like immigration and denominational growth, and in the revivalism on the frontier and stuff. Like, he emphasizes certain things that I think you'll get a new flavor, get maybe some new subtle insights on religious life in America that you maybe not have gotten from other similar books. And I think it deserves a place alongside a lot of other similar books that do have a similar goal, but maybe get at them with a different emphasis. So, anyways, yeah, those are my thoughts on Mark Granquist and Baker Academic's new book, A History of Christianity in America. Thanks, as always, for taking a few minutes to watch.